Okay, folks, for those in the room, welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of the magic of Massey as you were on the break there, as well as the good mingling with some great minds in the room. And for those online, thank you for coming back, or just joining us if you're just coming in right now. So we're going to go into our first panel session. The Genie is out of the bottle. While it's not exclusively around technology, it will focus a lot on it, the good, the bad, the ugly, the unknown. And I've got an all-star team with me here, who I'll introduce very shortly. I do want to prime the audience in the room and online. We've given an hour and a half for this session, not for you to sit and listen to us and be entertained, but for you to be informed by us, and then to have some really good informed questions or comments or issues that you want to raise. So at any point, literally at any point, if you want to raise a hand in the room, we'll get to you. If online you've got a question you want to pose, please type it into the chat, and our AV folks will be able to capture it, and we'll get to that question or that comment as quickly as possible. This will really work, because I know many of you in the room, you have your own expertise. It'll really work best if it is not us talking to you, but talking with you. And the same thing up here, folks. As we get into our rounds, feel free to jump in. Tony, you might want to comment on something that Ange just talked about. Ritesh may raise something that's really controversial, which I know he will, because that's just how he is. And people will want to challenge it, respectfully as always, in our commentary and our dialogue with each other, but let's make this as interactive as possible. So the genie's out of the bottle. The crime genie's out of the bottle, the technology genie's out of the bottle, the demographic genie's out of the bottle. They're all out of the bottle. How are we going to work with it? How are we going to make it turn more for good than for bad, and certainly away from evil? Tony, I'm going to ask you the first question here. I know for a fact, because you told me earlier on today, that you have been incredibly busy as your role as the Director of IT and Innovation at Peel Regional Police Service, which, by the way, pound for pound, is by far the most technologically advanced police service in Canada, I think in the top 3 in North America. And the reason why I put it at number 1 is that before they launched their major technology and innovation pieces, they worked with the Ontario Charter, Human Rights Commission to build a human rights charter around which their operational model and their technology streams are centered on. So last week, Peel Region hosted a international conference called The Safety of Our Cities, and touched on many of the issues that I presented earlier on. This is all old news for Tony. And I know every day his phone blows up and there's some challenge from a deputy chief like me that can't turn on their computer, to a rights challenge against a new technology that they're using to gather data and turn that into intelligence information for their officers. Tony, what keeps you awake at night? What's the issue that's driving your sector of the business and your role in supporting Canada's second largest municipal police service? What, if any, of the comments you've heard so far today aligned with your thinking and the direction you're going, or did we just miss something completely that this audience needs to be aware of?
Thank you, Peter. So first I want to talk about kind of what's going on in Peel today. So we've heard a lot of great discussion from Peter and a lot of the problems going on. And Peter really focused in on car thefts, which is a huge problem in the region of Peel. The numbers were up there, we're up 300%. There's really a lot of car theft going on. And no one is immune. One of my colleagues had waited 9 months for a brand new Toyota Tacoma pickup, and it was stolen from his driveway 3 weeks after he got it. So it doesn't matter who you are, the crime will come for you. And these are crimes that seemingly are of opportunity. I'll tie in a thread later on. The first thing I asked my colleague is, are you going to replace it with the exact same truck once insurance pays? He says, well, yeah, I am. And then I thought about that, and I thought about like my perspective on that is, if my pickup truck just got stolen because it's a high demand model, I don't know that I would buy the same one again because I'm waiting for the same people to come back and get it. So this is, you have to, again, recognize as citizens, this is how our thoughts are starting to change. That we're actually now maybe making choices of what products and services we'll consume based on criminality. I can't drive the car I want because I'm afraid it's going to get stolen, so maybe I'll buy a 5-year-old junker because I know it'll be there when I wake up in the morning. The thread that kind of runs through this that I want to talk about, another very big problem in Peel, is organized retail theft. So it's a very big problem in Peel. Liquor stores are getting robbed all the time. And I say rob, it's theft, not usually with violence. And part of it is because the criminal element know that the employees have been told not to intervene and to let the thefts continue because it's not worth anyone getting hurt over a few bottles of liquor. So that kind of emboldens them. And they're now professional shop thieves. And it's not people who are stealing to feed their addiction like it once was. It's not hungry people going to a corner store and stealing a loaf of bread. It's people who will commit a crime, get a fixed fee, usually $100 or $200 for the crime. That gets sold to, the merchandise then gets sold over to organized crime, who then monetizes that. So at the end of the day, it may not be apparent to the average citizen, but organized crime, the threat of organized crime ties through a lot of these different crimes, these retail crimes, but also online crimes. These are all very good ways to generate money and revenue. And there's no doubt that my chief often says, we're not going to arrest ourselves out of all these problems. We need to get upstream from them. Again, a quote from my chief, we need to get upstream from these problems and be able to intervene. That ties very closely to this community safety well-being model, which again is a lot of data-driven stuff, a lot of data sharing between agencies, getting people who have food insecurity or housing insecurity, employment insecurity, getting them employed so they don't necessarily fall into crime. And the underpinning of all of this is technology. This is how we're going to be able to share and enable and connect with people and communicate with people. I mean, today most people use, even though everyone will have a smartphone, it's odd that we call it a smartphone because it's rarely used as a phone. It's used as everything else first. Texting, apps, navigation. It's not about voice. It's about communication, electronic communication. And the last thing I kind of want to say in my role as an IT solutions provider is, yes, we handle complex things like hardware and software and put solutions together. But at the end of the day, it is our reason to exist is to support the business and deliver the solutions that will help solve the business problems. In this case, it's getting ahead of these criminal issues. And as a reactive, I mean, police are kind of the last line on the continuum. We're always reactive. There's been a crime, the police go and investigate and hold the people to justice. That's going to be there. But if we can get upstream, then that will change the way we are today and become much more proactive rather than the reactive where we are today. All of this, at the end of the day, will be enabled by technology.
Do you want us to ask questions yet or wait?
You jump in, Chief. I'm not going to block you.
Go right here, just a guy. But the two examples you brought up are really near and dear to my heart.
Wait,
not buying the vehicle that you want.
for the online audience, we need you to have the microphone so they can hear.
So the two examples you brought up are really near and dear to my heart. Not being able to buy the vehicle or products you want because we're afraid it's going to get stolen. In Manitoba, what we did in terms of the liquor store theft was not the innocent citizen in -30, sometimes you see the light up outside of the store because you have to provide ID before you can go in to buy anything. Are we giving the criminal element too much power over us? I'm just putting it out there for discussion. It seems like we, the innocent, are being more penalized and punished as opposed to dealing with the problem. So I'd just like to have people's thoughts on that.
Devon, thank you very much for the question. I think this is the second contract I had for Deloitte was actually to an East Coast provincial liquor association that was looking at cannabis legislation, legalization. And we're trying to figure out how to secure their supply chain and their warehousing and distribution, including potentially creating parts of their liquor stores into cannabis outlets. So we're doing an assessment of the physical, cyber, and criminogenic issues around it. That was the first time that I walked into one of their stores, and literally as I was there talking to the manager, watched an individual walk into the vodka stand and literally just load into a duffel bag 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hammers worth of vodka and walk out the door. And I'm ready to go into Superman mode, ex-police. And all the employees were simply taking a look, writing things down, and logging into a report. I have to tell you, that is a challenge. Equally, though, that same organization, if an employee tackles, is hurt, is killed, and I saw that in my time in Toronto as a Scarborough, at the Scarborough Town Centre Mall, where in this case, an employee jumps in and while jumping in kills a young person. The liability issues are so high that when you do an enterprise risk management assessment, the loss prevention is where you take the hit and not on the crime prevention. So this is a challenge of competing systems and ecosystems, trying to find a place on the Venn diagram where it all overlaps perfectly, and very rarely does it happen. To your point, though, the more you enable criminality, the more likely criminality will escalate. And the more likely that local criminality, which might be for a loaf of bread, as Tony talked about, becomes transnational organized crime connected. And that's definitely the element that we're seeing now, where this is not just local people stealing retail issues or local gangs fighting it out over an 8-ball of crack cocaine. Literally, they are 1 or 2 steps removed from transnational organized crime, human trafficking, drug trafficking, organ trafficking. You can just imagine the list. So this is the challenge that we're really faced with. Where do we find that harm reduction model while still being able to demonstrate a punitive approach to prevent the worst forms of criminality? I think we're all searching for that magic spot. That is at the heart of the issues that we're dealing with. So really appreciate that question. Ritesh, in between firing you, and you're a lawyer now, so I just want you to know, not only is a former police colleague of mine, but now a lawyer, also runs the heart and soul of Canada, a small and medium-sized business, retail, and is the penultimate, literally penultimate immigrant story to this country in terms of bootstrapping from almost zero subsistence into being an incredibly contributing family on so many different levels. But with all that said, in 2012, there were 2 major shootings that happened in this city. The Eaton Centre shooting, where 2 gangbangers started firing away at each other in the food court of the Eaton Centre. 6 people were shot, 1 was murdered, including a young kid who got shot in the head as he was visiting the city and having a burger with his family. About a month after that, at a barbecue in a backyard in Danzig Street, 22 people were shot, 2 were killed. 2 gangbangers in an area less than half the size of this room opened up with each other. They never hit each other. They hit literally everybody else. And I was in charge of all of our frontline policing. Ritesh was working for me between being fired. And he got a hold of some proprietary software, interestingly prototyped here at University of Toronto, that allowed us to do some social media monitoring, rudimentary social media monitoring. He went and presented this with my support to our intelligence unit and our homicide unit, and within hours he was taken away from me. I didn't see him for 6 months while he was involved in solving 2 investigations that were going nowhere. You have seen the amazing, the good, the bad, and the ugly in policing. You're seeing it in private sector, in small business and large business. You've traveled the world in terms of your education, and you're a spokesperson on national and international media. What the heck is going on here, Ritesh? What keeps you awake at night, and what gives you hope that we're heading in the right direction, not the wrong direction?
Well, first of all, I am hopeful, and I appreciate all the times you fired me. I still, I think I'd get fired on average about once a week. But I did grow up in a family-run and operated business, so my dad would fire me multiple times a day. But that's a whole other story, and I know this is not a therapy session, so I will stop. Overall, look, I am hopeful, and I think kind of the trajectory of technology does open up a whole world of possibilities. I'm sure we'll get into that. You talked about cryptocurrency and blockchain. There's 2 billion unbanked people in the world who don't get access to finances. Well, now there's an opportunity for them to get access to finances. So I think that's really exciting. I think that leveraging certain types of technology can create net new efficiencies that we never really thought about before. I always, from a policing standpoint, I always looked at our crime analysts. I always joked around with some of them, and I was like, are you really crime analysts or like data cleansers? Because they spend 80% of their time cleansing data and not actually analyzing crime of why certain things were happening. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But as long as, I know Anne's going to get into this, we think about the privacy components, the legal components, the ethical components of this technology. So just, you gave that example of an individual driving a car with a newspaper. And, I think back to the issues around autonomous vehicles and how AI kind of plays into this ecosystem. And the example I like to give, and I know Devon's heard me say this example a few times, is the modern day trolley problem. So when we think about the trolley problem, you have a train that's going down the tracks, and it has a problem. There's the brakes don't work, and there's an issue. The issue is if it goes straight, there's somebody stuck on the tracks. Or if it veers left, there's an oncoming train. What do you do in that situation? Do you go straight through the tracks, or do you turn left? And I encourage everyone to go online and check out the MIT Moro machine. So if you haven't already done so, go have a look. And what it does is it puts you as a driver and gives you different scenarios. So you're driving a car and you're going straight down, and your brakes have failed, and you have an option. Option number one is you go through the intersection, but somebody's crossing during that intersection. Or option number two is you veer left and there's a bollard, and clearly you're going to die or be seriously injured. What do? And you have to pick. And they keep changing up the scenario. They will change up race. They will change up, it's now a woman with a stroller and it's just you. It's you and your entire family, but it's somebody with a walker, so clearly a senior citizen. What do you do in that situation? And it takes your results and it compares it to everyone else who's done the test. And you get your results of how the rest of the world, the thousands of people actually scored on this. And at that moment, you realize what a horrible human being you are. But on the flip side is that it is you making that decision. We're going to get to a point where AI is making that decision, and what decision is it going to make? So you ask me what keeps me up at night. It is the modern day trolley problem, and the programming that's gone into it, because it's still, when it comes to algorithmic transparency, why certain decisions are being made. I'm sure when we all go to ChatGPT or something and we type in a prompt and we get a response, it doesn't actually tell us how it got that response. You just get a response. And I think when it comes to traceability, having that transparency, knowing why you're getting the results, that's still a big issue. But we've gone to the point now where we're leveraging all this technology. I'm sure we all use WhatsApp, and you probably went to WhatsApp and it said Meta AI all of a sudden on your WhatsApp because generative AI is the future. You didn't really have an option in that, did you? Even all the big houses right now, all the office software that we use, productivity software, AI tools are actually being built right into it. It's not like you have an option. So the question becomes is, why are those decisions happening? And what is the good, the bad, and the evil that can come from it? And that's what keeps me up at night.
I'm not even sure you sleep at night, Ritesh, because I know how busy you are.
I nap.
Thank you for that. Just again, a reminder, if there's questions online or questions in the room, and I see my good friend Michael Bryant, and I've also got Tom Axworthy, I'm going to get you to come in. So I'm going to prompt you with a question while we take questions from the audience. Not what keeps you up at night, but tell us, without naming names, the people like me who would call you in the middle of the night and go, I can't sleep, I've got this privacy rights issue, or I want to do this thing, but I've got a block on the privacy end. I'm sure you get phone calls and have got phone calls from very important people dealing with very important issues. So if you could unpack one of those scenarios for us, as well as walk us a little bit into your privacy by design piece. Let me take a couple questions from the floor. I've got Michael Bryant in the room, and then I've got Tom Axworthy. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks to this esteemed panel. I mean, it really is impressive. I have a question actually for each of you. So I don't know how you're going to handle answering it, but I'll let Peter figure that out. Question about, and I'm showing my hand a bit about what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. Question about Peel and the extent to which it is integrated with other police forces or other parts of the justice sector or not. In other words, is there capacity to share information with OPP, RCMP, Toronto Police Service, et cetera? Is there capacity to share information? I don't mean intelligence about cases, but somebody has been arrested, somebody has been charged. As someone who used to run legal aid program in British Columbia, I'd love to know right away who of our clients has been arrested and charged, so we can try and get them a lawyer right away. And similarly, to what extent is there integration with prosecution? So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to finish all my questions and then shut up and let you figure out how we're going to answer them. The next question is, could you talk a little bit more about cleansing data, what that means, and why it is that the prioritization of cleansing data is problematic? And
it allows you to do so much afterwards.
You said something like you spend all your time cleansing data, right? I'm with you. If we don't have cleansed data, we have the worst artificial intelligence ever, right? I mean, just the worst. And lastly, in your remarks, are you going to talk about backdoor encryption and Canada and why we need to avoid backdoor encryption? Decryption, rather. Backdoor decryption. That's it. Those are my questions.
Awesome. They made it easy for me because there's no question for me, so I'm just going to moderate it in the order that you asked. Tony, sharing data between police agencies and maybe other agencies.
So yes, the technical capabilities exist. I think that the public would be surprised that the level of sharing is not what I think the public expects. Yet at the same time, it's a very fine balance between what we can share and what is private to individuals. So from a data sharing model, there's a very successful model that goes back literally 50 years. So criminal records are hosted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and every police service in Canada has the ability to query people and find out what their criminal records are. It also will show warrants. It'll show if there's any specific tags on the file. So it's been going on for a long time. We are moving ever closer to a more of a sharing model. Again, because the technology exists, part of this is already being enabled. So if I look at things like in-car cameras and also body-worn cameras, because everything is collected into a central point into the cloud, into the internet somewhere, it's very easy for us to then share because it's outside of our garden walls. So that's been a huge boon to that. I'm also going to credit COVID quite a lot because one of the challenges we had with sharing with, say, the judiciary is we find that the legal field very much is paper-based. If they can't touch it, they don't want it. Well, because of COVID, that kind of forced their hand. And then now we've kind of, this pendulum has swung the other way where we're finding some things that still need to be done in person. There's still the want to try to move the pendulum back a little bit. So I would say we're currently, and we have been now for about 6 years or so, been doing lots of electronic disclosure, lots of electronic bail hearings. But without COVID, I'm pretty sure none of that would have happened because there was a real reluctance to change. There's a real pedigree in the legal field if it's about paper and it's about what I can touch. And thankfully, COVID changed that.
Excellent. Tony, thank you. Ritesh, you want to handle the data cleansing piece? Not specific to crime analysts, but more broadly as well.
Yeah, and then also just building on some of the stuff that Tony talked about, right? I think that there's an ample opportunity to leverage technology. Like in the UK, there's something called Track My Crime. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with that, but essentially what it is, it's you put in your information, you have a unique code. You can actually track how that crime is going through the justice system. So if there's any conditions, there's access to resources, upcoming court dates, and all that starts when you have a framework. I think one of the big issues in policing and government within the legal profession is that there's no common framework. And once you have a common framework, something as small as a comma or a space will throw off a system, right? So, and as somebody who, like just recently I was working on a project where we had troves of data and it was, okay, the whole control F and try to do data sort. Well, some started with a period, some started with a zero that wouldn't show up. There were commas that weren't properly being filtered, and I was like, wouldn't it make more sense if everyone just had a common framework? That if there was a legislative framework, if there was something like guidelines of if you want to do business, this is exactly the way you collect data. So I think that's something that's happening, but something that we definitely need to push and have a common framework for data collection. And that also speaks to the data cleansing situation as well. There's two components, right? The first one being, do we have a common lexicon? Do we have the exact data dictionary? I won't mention the police service, but I remember this one situation where the report stated gun-related calls for service were up, and it was an astronomical number. And you're like, wow, this is very serious. Gun-related crime calls for service are up. And then when you start dissecting the data, if the call originally came in as a sound of gunshots, but it was fireworks, that was being captured. And the definition changed year by year. So clearly, you're not comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to oranges. So when you have transparency, right, we can now have, and a framework, you now have the proper data. Otherwise, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out.
Just for the record, that was not Peel Police who did that. That wasn't us.
I will not mention the police.
Wasn't us.
And it wasn't Peel. So
I hate when Ritesh gives a good answer to something because it undermines the times that I fired him. And I'm going to introduce you, ask you to speak to backdoor decryption, which I'm not even sure what that is. So I'm interested in the answer. And then I'd invite you, once you've concluded your answer to Michael, if you could unpack a little bit about the thoughts you have so far and what you're hearing today. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Ann Cavoukian, former privacy commissioner, I think the groundbreaking individual for cops like me to really understand what privacy was all about, why it mattered, and why we had to be as careful with that as we were with the lives of victims and the futures of accused. And I have to tell you, when I was introduced to you, it was like a godsend. It was like the sun came out after a long period of shadow and rain. I don't want to get too poetic here. She's a wonderful human being, and she is just an outstanding expert in this field. So Anne, over to you.
You're very kind. Thank you so much for those lovely, kind remarks. I want to first start by dispelling a few myths, which abound. Get rid of zero-sum models. Zero-sum means you can only have one interest versus another. Privacy versus security. Privacy versus policing. Win, lose, one or the other. So yesterday, get rid of that mindset. You have to have multiple interests represented. And from my first day as privacy commissioner, like a gazillion years ago, and I served 3 terms, one of the first things I did, I called the police department. I met with the police. I said, I want to work with you. And we had a wonderful relationship because I wasn't objecting to the police in any way. I just wanted to show them what was of concern to individuals. And one of the first things I used to do, so identity theft, huge, growing every day. Victims of identity theft who used to come to me as a privacy commissioner, seeking my help. And of course, I would give it to them. But I would say the first thing I want you to do, go to the police, file an occurrence report. Let them know that you have suffered from this. So it's not just you're making this up. This is real. Let them know, file an occurrence report, then I would work with them daily, and I would work with the police to try to find solutions. So get rid of zero sum. When I created Privacy by Design, when I became privacy commissioner, it was actually unusual because I joined the office, the commissioner's office, and it was full of brilliant lawyers, as you might imagine, who wanted to get down and dirty, if you will, after the crime was committed, and we have to find a solution. Now, I didn't disagree with that, but I wanted to be proactive. I wanted to embed proactively privacy protective solutions into the design of your operations so that you could ideally avoid the harms from arising. I wanted to eliminate the harms, but not by going after them after they'd been committed. I was hoping to do it before so we could avoid it. And I've got to tell you, Peter, I loved your slides. You had so many things by design. And that's what by design is about, that you think of this before the fact, before the harm has arisen. You address the issues, you find measures by which to protect the data, and then you go for it. And that's why I could work so effectively with the police during my terms as commissioner. I was commissioner for 3 terms. I loved it. And it was so important to work with them, hand in hand. And when they got it, that I wasn't against law enforcement. Are you kidding? Quite the opposite. But I wanted it to be done in a way that could be substantiated and held up. And that's what we did together. So by design simply means you embed privacy and security measures into the operations that you are working with before you initiate them. And by doing so, you can avoid so many harms. Was it 2010? God, we're going back a long time. There was privacy commissioners would meet once a year, usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of the conference, we would vote on certain things. And that year, Privacy by Design was being raised as something for my colleagues to vote on. Did they support it? Did they vote in favor of it? Should we do it or not? And I was amazed that 100% of them voted in favor of it. And afterwards, I was thanking them and expressing my surprise because most of them are lawyers, brilliant lawyers. I thought they would object to this. And they said, Anne, come on. Are you kidding? We know that just pursuing things legally means we only get the tip of the iceberg. The majority of the harms continue, and they continue to grow. We need to try to find ways to prevent the harms from arising. So that's the work I've been doing on privacy by design. There is so much interest in this. And when we talk about encryption, it's one of the critical things. So first of all, before encryption, when I talk to companies who come to me or government departments, I say, what you want to do is you want to de-identify the data. The harm in terms of privacy is having personally identifiable data extracted and used in ways that were never intended. We'll get to AI in a moment. I mean, AI nightmare. But let's just deal with this right now. So you can do that. You can de-identify data. So you have to alert people and who oversee the data to do that. And then I say, run with the data. You can do so much. That's why I always want a positive, some win-win outcome, which is what privacy by design is about. Make it work for you. And we can do this. We've done this again and again. The harms arise when people don't do that. Then you have personally identifiable data being used in unauthorized manners. The bad guys, the criminals get it, used in horrible ways that cause harm to the individuals. Extremely difficult to correct, and we work with the police to try to make it work, but it's extremely, extremely difficult. So if you de-identify the data from the outset, you're golden, and that applies to AI as well, artificial intelligence, because man, do you ever need strong guardrails around AI? We'll get to AI in a moment, but that's one of the things you can do. And I wanted to get to the encryption, the de-encryption. So when you encrypt data, that's a very strong measure, because then you have data that aren't just available for everyone to come and see because they don't understand it. It's encrypted, it's in code. And then you might say, okay, then that secures the data. It's protected forever, right? Well, for the most part. But I've talked to many hackers, as you might imagine, and I talk to them and I say, what do you do when you see encrypted data? And they say, look, most of the time it's not strongly encrypted. If we spent time, we could probably, de-encrypt it, but it's not worth our time. We'll just go to some other data set because most data is not encrypted. So the de-encryption, is that what you meant, Mike?
I mean, it's when the example was with Apple, where the FBI went to Apple and said, give us your key so we can solve this crime. And Apple said, if we give you the key, you're going to be able to open up.
Exactly.
That's backdoor encryption.
And that's why I applaud Apple in that scenario, because Apple has committed to those using Apple, its customers, its clients, that they protect your data very strongly, which they do. They strongly encrypt it, and they're not just going to just go wide open because there's a request. Now, if there is a crime that's been committed and the police go to court and they get a warrant, that's a different matter. Be my guest. The court has said you have right of access to the data. Through this warrant, you can access data. But you can't just go to Apple first and say, give me access to your data. Apple will always strongly protect your data, and that's a huge positive. Let's make sure we are tuned into that. So do you want me to stop? I know I could go on. And
Can I just add to that, Peter, if that's okay? So what was the outcome of that, right? The outcome was I think it was FBI or Department of Justice just went and got a hacker to hack into it, right? So that in itself is problematic. So it wasn't the issue, and Microsoft had a very similar issue as well, where they said, well, give us this piece of data on an American citizen, and they said, yeah, okay, but that data is physically located in Ireland, so you're gonna have to go through the MLAT treaty, so the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, to get that data instead of a simple production order, which, by the way, in the United States, as we're familiar, is a subpoena from a supervisory special agent can sign off on that, right? So there's even less guardrails there. So the issue was, I want the data, which I think is reasonable if you have a production order or some sort of judicial authorization, but then it was, and anything further, and give us the back door, and at some point it's like, know what you're asking for, right?
I couldn't agree with that more, because it's one thing to have a proper permitted access to the data that you're interested in. And you'll get that through warrants in the courts and other things. But then to say, well, let's just open this up a bit and let's go wide open. That's what you can't do. And you want to follow the law. You want the police to work with you in support of legal solutions. Because a lot of this, especially in the US, is being taken to court, and companies are being blown away by not protecting the data of their customers, of their clients. So I always look for, the the win-win solution. You know, call me the eternal optimist, because you can never give up hope. You have to continue to pursue this. And I'm not suggesting for a minute it's easy to do. If anything, with AI, it's getting harder to do, but even more important to put the guardrails up, because AI can go and obtain thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces of data, never consented to, never authorized, in personally identifiable form, use it in ways that are inconceivable in terms of the potential harm that can arise to individuals. So as I said, I used to work very closely with the police, for whom I have the greatest respect, and we can find ways to do this. And also with tech people, encryption, decryption, there are ways to do this, and we can't give up on it. I just want to say a reminder, privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. If you value free and open societies, you value privacy enormously. I can't tell you, I was born, I'm Armenian, but I was born in Egypt, in Cairo. My family came to Canada when I was 4 years old. Why? Because Egypt had been under British rule at that time, and my parents had enormous freedom and it was wonderful. And then the British pulled out, Abdel Nasser came in, closed up everything. Your bank accounts, you couldn't access any money. My father was a very well-known photographer. He could only take photographs of Nasser and nobody else. My parents, I mean, you wouldn't believe the restrictions, freedom out the door. And if you're Armenian, having gone through the Armenian genocide, freedom is everything to you. So this is what I fight for. And we came here, we started with nothing, because my parents couldn't take any of their money out. But we started with nothing. At least they had a freedom that they could start rebuilding our lives. So I'm eternally grateful to them and eternally grateful to the concept of freedom. You can't have it without strong privacy and security working hand in hand.
Amen. So what kept me up last night was this. I thought the panel, as busy as they are, would be kind of muted and not particularly enthusiastic about this, and I thought there'd be no questions from the floor. So I'm gonna have a great sleep tonight. Now the questions are piling up. I have Tom Axworthy up next in the room. There's an online question that I then have to get to. I have a lady here and a gentleman here. So buckle yourselves in, folks. We're in for a ride. Go ahead, Tom.
As in your keynote, Peter, and then on the panel, the major focus has been around technology and the future and how it can be used. But as you were all talking, my thoughts went back. You're talking about a brave new world of technology. I went back to an old world where there was a different framework, and I just would be interested in the panel's perspective. One of my colleagues at Harvard years ago was James Wilson, who developed the theory of broken windows. And the broken windows were that in a community, something as trivial as a warehouse with a broken window had a smidgen of disorder. And if that wasn't fixed, within a couple of days, you might see a car that had been broken. And he went on to develop a major theory about having to deal quickly and immediately of signs of disorder. But his solution was the human dimension. Now, he made a major point about patrols and the human dimension of policing and knowing your clients and getting them out of cars. And this may be a very old debate, but his whole theory was we had to begin to have trust between the policing and the people in the area, and that only began when you began to know them. And you could together stop the windows from getting broken because you could find out who owned the warehouse. Now, that was the human dimension of policing. And his theory went to the key was trust. And you had to get to know your force, and the force had to get to know the area. Does that still apply in this brave new world of technology you've all been discussing? Where's that human dimension? Where's that trust? And should we still be worried about broken windows?
So it's a great question, and at some risk, you've asked one of those things that I'm passionate about. So I don't want to suck up too much of the oxygen, but I would invite others to jump in. Let me start off with this. Broken windows theory. I won't talk to the academic rigor of it. I think it's strong and well established. It was the application of the theory by policing that made it go wrong, and to some degree, technology played a role. Data certainly played a role. So in the dawn of application NYPD, New York Police Department, started to bring in the academics who then gave enough information for the police officers to become, I'll be very polite, dangerous. So New York City had a huge problem with their transit system, crime on the transit system. They applied the broken windows theory to people jumping the turnstiles. If we stop them jumping the turnstiles, that will have a downstream effect of stopping stabbings, shootings, rapes, homicides on the system. So they enforced the hell out of turnstile jumpers. To some degree, it affected the downstream crimes. The success, though, of that was then applied literally to almost every other crime. So anything that is broken in any community, if we enforce the hell out of it, will have a net benefit effect. And for short periods of time, yes, New York City had a significant decrease in crime. Interesting, research after the fact showed that crime was decreasing in other cities that weren't using the same situation. So it was more macro issues than it was anything specific in New York. But because the NYPD is still the biggest and the most influential police service, a lot of other police services started to misapply the misapplication of data management against the theory of broken windows policing. And in a very short order, we found municipal police services across the US and across Canada using what NYPD called a ComStat model of data, aggressive enforcement at the neighborhood level to drive down crimes. And what they were finding was the crimes were starting to come back up again and the trust was being driven down. Those were the early precursors of things like carding and street checks, quantity over quality, efficiency over efficacy, crime reductions over trust reductions. So I'll park my comments there in terms of how great theory misapplied, layered on by systems in institutions that were then and still now struggling with even accepting, never mind addressing, systemic discrimination, had really unintended outcomes that people are still suffering with to this day. I'd be interested from the thoughts of the panel around the technology application now that has carried on since the ComStat days, and I'll open up to any one of you that want to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in. And the first thing I want to say, Tom, is that you've referred to police departments as forces, and that's something that in the Canadian context has gone away many years ago. They're police services, so just even changing what we call ourselves kind of changes the idea of what we do. We serve the community.
Hold that thought, because this is my personal rant. Hold that thought. Can I tell you right now in Canada, with great respect to my colleague from Peel, right now in Canada, the pejorative description and definition of policing is law enforcement. From the Prime Minister to the Premier to the Mayor, from experienced journalists to some of the best police chiefs, they refer to themselves as law enforcers in the industry of law enforcement. And that is a complete undermining of the institution of policing in this country. That is my personal rant. You will never hear me refer to a police officer as a law enforcer, a police service as a law enforcement agency, and the job of policing as a job of law enforcement. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. And to tie that into kind of broken windows theory and the rest of what you're talking about, I've been in policing over 30 years, and about 20 years ago, one of the projects we were working on at the time was to make the vehicle the mobile office, right? And that's what it was. But to your exact point, in order to build trust, you need to get people out of the vehicles. So we've evolved that idea to now the person is the office, smartphones and enabling technology in people's hands so they can get out in the community and they can have access to the information that they need to do a good job, and they can interact with the community and exchange information and collect that. The one general comment I'll make that I think applies to every piece of technology, including AI, is that it's a tool. And like anything else, it can be used for good and can be used for harm. And the analogy that I often use is if you think of a hammer in the hands of a carpenter will build a house, can do marvelous things. In the hands of somebody who wants to destroy, it can smash windows. It could be used for criminal element. We have to focus on it's not the tool, but the intent of the tool and the application of the tool. So if we're using tools responsibly, in accordance with the way society will allow us to use them, we're going to get good outcomes. And the reason I tie into that is because at Peel, we're currently engaging our community around an AI community of practice, code of conduct. We're with the Human Rights Committee, bringing them in and saying, here are the tools that we have. How do you best think we can serve the community without disadvantaging anybody, without systemically discriminating? And again, one of the things about AI is it's all about how you train it. If you train it with biased data, you're going to get biased results. So how can we overcome some of these issues for the greater good and to help the community?
And if I could just add, trust is waning. It's just going out the door, unfortunately. Trust is essential in our operations, the groups we work with, the departments, et cetera, but especially with the massive growth of AI in such a short period of time. And let me be clear, I see all the benefits of AI. There are enormous benefits in the medical field and various services. So it's not that I'm opposed to AI. Remember, privacy by design is privacy and fill in whatever, in this case, privacy and AI. But you have to ensure that privacy is embedded into the operations before the AI is operational. Because if you don't do that, you will have no privacy. You have to put the guardrails up and anticipate the potential harms by not doing it before you implement the AI or whatever solution you're seeking. And that's the missing link right now. And I'm working with another group on another project where it's all about trust is just diminished so dramatically and the fear that that will continue.
Absolutely. Ritesh?
Yeah, I think a big issue is we're trying to figure out how to fly the plane while it's in the air, and a lot of the technology is just being implemented. I'll give a quick example, and then I know we got some more questions. But when it comes to policing technology, post 9/11, there was clearly a huge emphasis on technology. We look at New York, LA, mainly New York, and they got hundreds of millions of dollars. Who knows how much money they got? But sometimes the technology makes sense, but unless you hit that pause button, do your due diligence, really think things through, talk to experts before implementing, you have a negative outcome. And one of those issues was, I believe it was New York, or I forgot which, it must have been New York or another city. Regardless, they put radiation detectors across the city. And the whole idea was if there was a spike in radiation, the SWAT team essentially, or the tactical team, would come and investigate. Now, what happened was they started getting readings all over the city that there was an increase in some sort of bionuclear reactions that was happening. So you'd have the SWAT team come up and take people down at essentially gunpoint. Turns out what was triggering these sensors was individuals who just had chemotherapy. Right? So clearly you have that spike with one of these sensors. But and very noble cause, right? But the false positives that were coming out of it just weren't thought of. And we see that with shot splatter, we see that with automated enforcement technology, kind of the false positives, and then having somebody to go through a system, or in this case, victimization, when the technology had all the noble, good intentions, but because it wasn't really thought through properly, had very negative consequences.
And I'm so glad you raised that, Ritesh. The notion of false positives is just keep that in your mind, because the intent is always a positive one, to be helpful, to be positive, etc. And the same with the police when they collect some information and then it expands and they want to keep collecting more that they may not be authorized to have. False positives cause so much harm, and especially to those collecting it. I mean, it causes harm to the implications of those whose information has been collected in an unauthorized manner, but then to those who are collecting it, who are then later prosecuted, this will do you in. You have to get rid of false positives.
So I just want to add really quickly to the other part of that. So false positives, unintended consequences. Yes. The things that we didn't want to happen happened.
I'm going to have to get my moderator muscle on here, or we'll never get through all the questions. Outstanding question, Tom. Great answers, everyone. Joe, can we go to the online question? And then I've got another hand up on the other side of the room, so third in the online room yet. So online question. So Noel, thank you. Many Canadians are falling victim to fraud, often online. There is a perception that the Canadian justice system is too lenient on fraud and economic crime. Is this true, and what can we do better? Maybe I'll kick this one off quickly here. Online fraud for private individuals, small, medium-sized business, probably the largest core crime that is happening in the country. Police departments, police services, police investigators are overwhelmed with almost every crime category. At some point, you have to start a prioritization process. And what happens inevitably is two things. What's the higher order types of crimes? Your murders, your shootings, your gang and gun and drug-related violence, domestic violence, sexual assaults, and somewhere down the bottom of the list becomes a victimless crime, or a crime where a human body is not directly impacted, although obviously the loss of a bank account or wealth will have that impact downstream. So scarce resources against unending demand will inevitably mean that those lower level, big air quotes, lower level crimes get the least amount of resources. Couple the fact that literally in the last 10 years, certainly post-pandemic, there has been a pandemic of online crime. There are simply not enough police officers and police services anywhere in Canada, anywhere in the world to begin to put a dent in any of this. So to the question that Noel posed, there really is not a solution for that. I would say that if we truly want to even begin to get back into the game of preventing, investigating, prosecuting, and otherwise addressing online crimes, cyber-related crimes, but particularly frauds that we're talking about, you're going to have to go well beyond the establishment of police services or national security agencies. The private sector is going to have to play a major role. Education systems will have to be training our children on this in kindergarten. Entire university programs will have to be rejigged, particularly business programs, to enable this to become frontal lobe, basic operating model design before we get anywhere close to resolving the issues that Noel talked about. I welcome any other thoughts from the panel members.
Just quickly, the online theft of 2020s is the stolen bicycle of the 1980s. If you have a bicycle stolen, you don't bother reporting it because it's never going to get found, and it cost you $150. Fast forward 40 years, it's online theft, you lost $500 or $1,000, police are too busy, you don't even report it anymore.
This is an absolute crisis. Canadians coast to coast to coast are being victimized. There's no support. The role of police services is to find who's the hacker or the fraudster. It is not to make the victim whole. I think there's a component is if you get victimized by a fraud, you want to get your money back. Like at the end of the day, you want to get your life savings back, and there's no resources. One of the things that I actually testified in Parliament about this very issue, mainly around small businesses that were being victimized, and I said one of the things that we really need is some sort of hub where victims, it could be virtual, it could be physical, where victims of these types of crimes can come in and get the support. Like if you think about Bitcoin scams, that involves cipher tracing, so blockchain analysis. It involves some very complex issues. It also involves understanding Bitcoin wallets. There's a policing component because you need production orders or you got to go through MLATs. There's a fraud component through the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. But unfortunately, there isn't a single entity that an individual can go to that will collect all the information, disseminate it appropriately, and then provide resources to make the victim whole again. And that's the reason I think we're seeing this crime at a scale that no one's ever seen before. Individuals are being victimized, small businesses are being victimized. Just recently, there was a small business that had a order. Somebody called in, they pretended to be a purchaser for a company. This is something I dealt with. They clearly weren't. And they paid with a credit card. Well, it turns out that credit card was stolen. And what the payment processor did was they took $20,000 out of the small business's bank account. And they said, because this is a fraud investigation, even though you did all your due diligence, collected all the information, because now this is under investigation, we're going to take that money out of your account. That's detrimental to the small business. Clearly, we're not thinking this through. So I think that this is a crisis. I think it requires a lot more work. I think it requires more collaboration and an honest discussion, because you need to assist the victims. We need to catch the people that are doing this, but it's not. It's a joint responsibility.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Something that Peter said. I agree with everything you said, Ritesh. It's just appalling, the state of affairs. Getting something into the education system so that students from a young age can learn how to address these issues. in terms of encryption, decryption, how to protect your data. I mean, do something, because all of our lives, especially with kids, everything's online. I mean, you see kids walking around on their cell phones, tripping everywhere because they're not seeing people walking. And so it's so important to formally, I think, get that into the education system now at a very young age, to teach these kids as they're growing up, and some of these concerns. I think that's critical.
Absolutely, great. Going to go back to the floor. Okay, we have the question here.
I guess a lot of my questions are being answered in this panel, but how are you applying context as well as design to the data? For example, like the data changes all the time, people's behavior changes, data can be, like it could be outdated. You might be using outdated data, and especially the use of real-time data I think is super important. And how are you, like we talked about an informed citizenry, how are you verifying this data within the community? What are the types of partnerships that you're using? Are you taking data into the community and asking people, is this accurate, not accurate? What kind of outliers as well as patterns are you also looking to, interpret? Because the interpretation and the context is everything, and you are and are not your data, because you are also an individual as well.
Great question. Anybody want to take a first jump at it?
Maybe just a quick comment, right? I think that's why we need open data portals. I think we need to mandate that for a lot of organizations, police services, governments. Open data is a thing. But I get back to that framework. I get back to different organizations only put out certain pieces of data. And I think if we're going to really get this right, we need to invest more in open data portals. We need to make it more accessible. You shouldn't be able to go online and just download a big CSV file. Like, what on earth does that mean, right? You got to be able to slice and dice it, see it on a map, get the context, and make it super simple and accessible for all Canadians. And I think that's the answer.
And I agree with that, but anytime you're dealing with personally identifiable data, you should be in control. You should know what's happening to your data. Doesn't matter how big the context or how small. Is it being given to unauthorized third parties that you haven't consented to? I want to put you back in control of your data. And there's no reason why companies or governments can't do that. They've been abusing the uses of your data far too long, and if we get into a privacy and security by design model up front, there will be measures in place that your data will be used for these purposes that have been consented to with the full awareness of the data subject. And then if additional uses are contemplated, they have to come back to you and obtain your consent, get awareness. We've got to bring this back to the data subject.
Yeah, I agree with everything my two colleagues said here, but I think we have to consider too that some of the data we collect as police services we do under statute. For example, when we arrest somebody under the Identification of Criminals Act, we're able to collect that PII and keep it, and we're very responsible with that. Well, that's something that we that's something we cannot share. It's PII. So there are some, and I agree with Anne saying that our data should be voluntarily given up. Like when you go to Facebook and you join, they give you all the terms and conditions and you have to accept. In some cases, like Identification of Criminals Act, that's actually being collected whether you like it or not, because we need to be able to collect it so that we can hold you accountable in the justice system. So that, I think, kind of is a tangential use case to the other data I think that Anne and Ritesh are talking about.
Excellent. Great question. Thank you. Next question from the floor.
First of all, my compliments to each of the speakers, primarily as well as the first speaker. Fascinating. To me, it's the Kantian epistemic dilemma, where we have a synthetic statement versus a non-synthetic statement. And it goes into where our civics is ascribing or not ascribing. It is truly a dilemma. Politics has become utterly transactional. More in the States because of financing to become elected. Less so in Canada, but we're hybriding very, very well. And that, to me, is what keeps me up at night, and it's worrisome. We need leaders who are going to think apolitical, do what is in the long-term interest as opposed to short-term, to be elected and then re-elected, and it is creating corrosion. So indirectly, what is being discussed today is a central element. And how is it going to be dealt with? Will it be dealt with congruently, or or will it be dealt with on an ad hoc basis? And the citizen is becoming more and more diminished, and it's actually refracted in our parliamentarians. Unless you are within a very elite, discrete cabal, and many ministers are not even in the elite, discrete cabal, you are absolutely nothing. And what that does to one's moral fiber, I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very passionately said. I will, I think we can talk about a lack of trust. I've mentioned it, Anne has mentioned it. There's any number of studies that will talk about the significant decline in public trust in policing, but interestingly, we're not the least of the least trusted. So we're seeing that in education, in healthcare, we're seeing it in journalism, we're seeing it in private sector businesses, in large multinational companies. Trust in our neighbors is at the lowest point. Trust in our politicians of all stripes, at all levels, for many of the reasons that you just talked about. Transactional politics, my least favorite, performative politics, the politics of division, the politics that feed into and actually create polarization, and then layer on top of that geopolitical issues where constant meddling, direct interference, and nation-state attacks against trust factors of our institutions are all at play now where they were not even a scant 10 years ago. So this is a major issue. If we're going to have the types of solutions that are necessary to address these very complex and long-term problems, our political institution has to be as robust as our justice institution, our journalism institutions, et cetera, et cetera. I'd welcome other comments on that, but.
I agree with everything this gentleman said. I have such dismay that our political systems are going to improve dramatically, or hopefully improve even somewhat. I know we've got elections coming up, and I look at the untruths, if you will, that have been proliferated for the past, 4 or 5 years federally. I mean, it drives me crazy. So I don't want to get into politics here because I won't stop. But I agree with you, sir, and Kant.
So for those of you that might be able to stay to the last panel session, Jim Rankin is actually convening a panel designed exactly for that question. So I'm gonna jump ahead of Jim a little bit at some risk, because he's a journalist who has barrels of ink and paper to bury me if I get any of this wrong. But assuming we get the glass half full here as we walk you through the day, and that we feel confident that Canada, while in a fragile state, is strong enough to potentially not just survive, but thrive and lead, how do we keep the institutions in check? Who watches the watchers? Who holds to account the people with the greatest power? And what are the new guardians of truth and institutional accountability in this new world? And that's essentially the panel that Jim is going to host this afternoon. And we're going to hear from academics, journalists, and activists, who I believe are the key guardians of the future truth. So,
Could I just add one thing to that, because I totally agree with you. But you have to have independent bodies who oversee the activities of the government, for example, and who really walk the talk. So when I was privacy commissioner, I didn't report to the government of the day, and I spoke out a lot against government operations when I felt that they were not respectful of privacy and security, etc. These days, let me tell you, I get calls all the time from the media, which I'm happy to receive, about interviews about various topics of the day. But at the end of each one, I say, why haven't you gone to the privacy commissioner? You should be going to the privacy commissioner to talk about this. And they say, are there still privacy commissioners? I say, of course there are. Go. And then others will say, we've tried. They won't talk to us. It's like there's a change in mindset. And people have to understand the independence is essential in those roles. Independence of government. That's why you're there, to oversee the activities of the government and ensure that the public is being protected.
I'll just, Peter, if that's okay, I'll just quickly add to it. So just building on that from another perspective, and that is the power of tech organizations in kind of shaping public policy and just the way we deal with our day-to-day lives. One of the things that I'll never forget, again, just like I wouldn't mention the police service, I won't mention this tech company. And I was in a conversation with them, and they said, we are a Canadian company because we follow the laws of Canada. And then in the next breath, they said, it's not our problem that the laws of Canada are inadequate. And it makes you think that it's not about the legislation and all that stuff. Are we looking at it as the floor or the ceiling in society? And I've always looked at it as the floor. It's the bare minimum we have to do to participate. But everything we do above that, as organizations, as individuals, as communities, is the value add to society. So having that process, having a value-added approach, because clearly we all know how slow the institutions can be. So at that point, who's going to fill the gaps? And I would look at these organizations to hopefully fill the gaps.
Outstanding, thank you. Sorry for all my hand waving up here. I was trying to do air traffic control for the questions on the floor. So we have another question over here from this gentleman.
Yeah, so just based on some statements that were made, spoke about technology and how it could either free us to be more human or the opposite direction. Who's making the decision? We spoke about like false positions that could come from data. A question for you is, with AI, how do you evaluate and monitor to make pivots real time, as opposed to like we did historically? We know you have the 5-10 year longitudinal studies to learn lessons, but based on the pace to which AI is shifting culture and the pace which is impact, 5 to 10 years, like multiple lifetimes at the pace to which AI is impacting stuff. So could you speak to like how do you evaluate, monitor, and pivot real time, because we don't have the luxury for 5-10 years evaluation and learnings based on the pace?
Okay, I'm just going to start off and turn over very quickly. If it doesn't get answered now, or even if it does get answered, ask that of Jim's panel as well, because I think that's a great question for institutions like academia to be able to bring almost near real-time research to allow to inform institutional leaders about things that are going well or not going well. So I think it's a great question for now, but also I think it would be a great question for later on. Anne, you want to kick off?
You have to ask questions. So someone is implementing the AI. It doesn't come out of the air. Someone is introducing it, and they have to be responsible for the way the AI is operating and being used. So if you were asking me to examine an AI system, I would go in and I would say, oh, are you scrubbing all personally identifiable data before the AI kicks in? Of course not. I know the answer to that. And I would say, then you have to do that. You have to put guardrails around the AI before it kicks in. And that's what privacy by design is all about, is before the whatever it is operational, you examine the methodology and the ways in which it is engaged. And then you put the guardrails up so that you can have some sense of privacy and security measures being implanted into the AI. And if people tell you, well, that's not possible, that's nonsense. I work with a company called Private AI, and that's exactly what they do in terms of the AI they offer, and they show customers, they lead with what they're doing to protect the data in terms of personally identifiable information before the data kicks in, and then it works beautifully. So you have to speak up and not just be accepting of, well, it's AI, there's nothing we can do. There's always something you can do.
It's also being legislated, right? So with Bill C-27, there's the Artificial Intelligence Data Act. I believe that's the act. Again, you can agree or disagree. I know there's a lot of controversy. There's 3 components to Bill C-27. The first one being the amendments to PIPEDA. So there's going to be all the stuff Anne talked about, consent. There's going to be a plain language doctrine as well. So when you hit I agree, you got to know what on earth you're agreeing to, because most people aren't lawyers and they don't read. And I'm sure everyone reads through every single line before hitting I agree. But so it's going to make it easier. It creates a privacy tribunal as well. And the third component, which is probably the most controversial component, is high-impact AI systems. The point being that if you don't think about this stuff now, when that does become law, you're not going to be able to sell your product. You're not going to be able to monetize your product. You're not going to be able to use your product. Governments and organizations won't buy it because you won't be in compliance. So start thinking about these things now, because the legislation is coming, and a lot of other jurisdictions have already legislated the use of high-impact AI systems.
If I could just jump in really quickly, there's a bit of a myth in your question that I'd like to dispel, and that it's not a zero-sum game. So it's not, if it's not real time, then it's useless. and sometimes you want to take some time to take it, and maybe a day-old data is okay, and a week-old data is okay. So it's not real time or bust. Because in fact, in the heat of a moment, you might make a decision, but if you waited 5 more minutes and you got a bit more data, your decision might have been better. So I think it's really important to understand the real-time data is not the be-all, end-all. And I'll use a very simple analogy. If you walk into a burger joint and they have a bunch of burgers there waiting for you and you get one, that's real time. But if you go to a different burger joint, you might wait 3 minutes and get a fresh hot burger. So sometimes the juice is worth the squeeze if you wait a little bit longer. You know what I'm saying? I think the same thing applies to data. And that it's not all about real-time data. Sometimes you need a little bit more.
Wow, I just got hungry all of a sudden. I'm not sure why. Tom, have we got burgers on the lunch menu? Awesome, thank you. I have another question from the floor here.
Great discussion this morning. My name is Wendy Feldman, and I've just really enjoyed your discussion today. I've attended a couple of events in the last little while about combating anti-Semitism. In fact, the last presentation was at Beth Torah Synagogue with a few members of representatives of 3 levels of government, which I thought was really interesting. And they all turned to enforcement by police as the solution. And interesting, I thought, was they were all starting to talk to people who were concerned about reaching out to urge police to have further training in the prosecution of hate crimes, anti-Semitic atmosphere, to say that it not just schools and universities with their codes of conduct, but to look at policing and to talk about the laws that are already on the books, to not look at to changing the criminal code, but to have police actually use what's there. I'm wondering if you can talk about the real-time prosecution that you were just speaking about, but also over time, anticipating crowd sizes, anticipating the, misuse of municipal facilities, and the role that police might have in this touchy area.
No, very touchy area, very difficult one. And I can speak from that on multiple layers of experience. In fact, one of the slides I had up was the deliberations around the right to protest. Where is the right side of the line around what is peaceful, lawful protest, peaceful, unlawful protest, violent and unlawful protest? And those are all very moving targets. I'll tell you one thing, this is a personally held view, and it is also one based on over 30 years in policing. The police are not there to decide who's right in an argument. The police are not, should not, be enforcing one side of the argument over the other side of the argument. And so there's technology, and there's disinformation and polarization, and a whole bunch of politicalization and weaponization of issues that are wrapped in there. But I think where Canada and a lot of places have got it wrong is that the police should always be on my side of the demonstrated issue. And that is not where they're supposed to be, nor is the justice system. I'll come to the issue of hate crimes. It is, again, not quite as bad as the epidemic of fraud and the crisis of fraud that Ritesh talked about. But we've had an epidemic of hate in this country for a very long time, particularly during the pandemic and post-pandemic period. It is, shouldn't be unsurprisingly, an issue of human rights, charter rights, and geopolitical issues, not the sweet spot for policing. So yes, managing a protest or demonstration, getting people through signalized intersections, identifying protest and counter-protest, to some degree, negotiations around whether or not there will be lawful or unlawful activity, trying to mitigate what could be reasonably anticipated as unlawful or unsafe activity, is really the bailiwick of policing. But settling the debate to which some geopolitical issue on the other side of the world can or should be demonstrated, litigated, or in any way talked about on this side of the world, I do not believe that is the bailiwick of policing. I go back to my presentation earlier on. The demonstrations that we've seen in this country, from the Freedom Convoy, to the pro-Palestinian, to anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, Black Lives Matter post-George Floyd. The police have a role to play in it, but there is no police solution for those demonstrations. There may be a whole of society solution in there, but there is simply no police solution for those issues. I suspect that did not answer your question, but that is the best that I can do right now, and I invite my colleagues to weigh in on it. Or not.
You did a very good job answering.
Thank you, Devon. Appreciate that. Great question, though. I am going to just flag we are turning the corner into the last 15 minutes, and again, I encourage online or in-person questions. We'll try to discipline ourselves and make sure that we are, as I wasn't, a little more brief and succinct in the answers. Over here to the floor.
Regards to the AI, I'm with the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. I'm actually a member there, and I sit on a number of AI working groups, some to do with large language models, and education. Okay, so they're trying to figure out what standards to put in place for education facilities, and to the risks of AI across the board. So the engineers are working to develop these standards. They're not quite there yet, so that's the problem. It's come very rapidly, and the standards aren't in place quite yet, and then you're going to have laws as well in the middle of all that. So that's just an update on that. My question, and it does touch upon what Wendy, we go way back to Kuching days, public policy stuff, but it also touches upon the hyper increase in crime. I work with 14th Division as a co-chair of I was co-chair of the Community Police Liaison Committee, which is an amazing program within the city of Toronto and other police services. And I'm quite active in my neighborhood around public safety and police. I've seen the rise of crime. I'm from Scarborough. I went to high school with Peter Sloly, so we have a background in Scarborough and things like that. My question, and I've been stumping about this for a number of years now, is to what degree has the Century Initiative and the hyper immigration policies of our government, and supported by industry, by the way, and that's another story altogether, has contributed to the major increase in crime, as well as exacerbation of social issues, because these are social matters ultimately, right? And strain the fabric of our society. And I throw the question to you four individuals.
Well, you guys saved all the tough ones for the end of the session here. Again, it feels like a minefield to walk into, but hell, I've walked into a few of them in my time. Let me start off. Obviously I'm not an academic, and there are in this room, and I hope later on when you see Julius Haag, for instance, U of T professor, this will be an excellent question for him to either ask again or resubmit in a slightly different way. Certainly my understanding from research, first generation immigrants have a much lower level of criminality. It is born through less high in second generation. Third, I'll go to economics. Without a labor force and an aging population, there's nobody around to pay the bills. There isn't an economic sustainability factor without major immigration for first world countries, particularly G7 countries. Layer on top of that, we can bring tons of people in, but if they don't have a home, if they can't get employment, if they can't even get educated in certification, then like my dad and maybe your dad, my dad was a lawyer in Jamaica. He sold vacuum cleaners for the first year to pay the bills for the Sloly boys. So I have the lived experience, some degree, the research supports it, and certainly my time in policing. I found some of the most rich and resilient communities were often the newest comers, those who were supposedly on the ostracized, marginalized, and racialized spectrum. They were the ones that showed up at those community police liaison committees in 14 Division, in 43 Division, in 23 Division. And they were the ones, because they were the most vulnerable, were working the closest with the police to save their kids, to protect their families, to grow their businesses, and to make their contribution. For me, I think it is one of those eternal myths that somehow newcomers are a significant, disproportionate, negative impact on the health and wealth of any first world society. That is an opinion that I hold dearly. And I believe the glass is half full. This is a country of immigrants, and is a country of our indigenous brothers and sisters. And it is from those two strengths that this country has built its foundation and will go forward. So I invite other comments as well.
So I'll jump in on the world according to Tony as an individual. The question presupposes that immigration is the root cause of crime. And there's not, I don't think, Peter has kind of indicated, that's really the question. So is there more crime because there's more immigrants? Perhaps it's just a population's number. Don't know. Also, I think we have to look at the origin of where our newcomers are coming from. For example, there are many places in the world where the police are distrusted, right? So there's a reluctance for them to come forward. They see the police coming, they think here comes oppression. So there's a lot of, from the Rutman School of Business, this is a wicked problem, and it's not going to be a simple answer as, oh, if we just reduce immigration, crime is going to go down. If it was only that simple, if it was only a simple thing, there's going to be a lot of levers to pull into the machine to figure out how do we solve crime and disorder. And it's not just one thing. So I don't know necessarily that we can just say it's because of an increase of newcomers. I kind of tend to share Peter's sentiment on that. But population has grown up. There is competition for homes. There is competition for jobs. And if people are hungry, you might resort to criminality to feed yourself or to feed your family. So I think it's much more of a complex issue than it seems on the surface.
And I think just adding to that, putting a kind of a tech spin on it, right, is where do we get these types of sentiments from, right? Where they're the ones that are being propagated online. And when we think about misinformation, disinformation, the role of these platforms from disseminating information that's not evidence-based, that's not been verified, that in itself is going to be the single biggest issue. So, academics aside, clearly we all watch the news, we all go online, and we're hearing more and more about these issues that really aren't issues, but they're blown way out of proportion because your feed is bombarded with it. And I think that is in itself something that just needs to be addressed and just building on, because I do agree with Peter and Tony on their sentiment as well.
If I could just jump in really quickly, like we all probably use Google, I love it. But you know what I call Google? The confirmation bias machine. It's all about how you put your question in. Do immigrants cause more crime? Here's a whole bunch of people who agree with me. Do naturalized citizens cause more crime? Here's a whole bunch of... So we got to be very careful in how even we phrase our question, because we're going to get an answer to the question that we asked, which may not necessarily be the truth.
Great comments. Thank you. Thank you. Great question. And these are the questions, I mean, I don't want to say this is a representative sample of Canada, but it's a representative sample of people who are thinking deeply about these and are wanting to use this opportunity as it was intended when Tom put this on, when Tom Axworthy put this on, to ask really tough questions and to get as thoughtful a set of answers as you can, all of which we hope you'll take away and share in other conversations and wrestle with it yourselves and come to some better place. And we all come to some better place. So I've got another question over here. Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Luis. I worked for 20-something years as an investigative journalist in the U.S.-Mexico border. Also, life took me 5 years to work as a crime analyst for the state police in the border, and one of my portfolio was drug cartels. So I have a kind of a little bit of experience in both sides of the desk. So while I was working for the police, I saw the transition and how hard it was from old police officers into tech. Now, the question is, now we have a new generation of police officers, 20-something, those who were born with the internet already. And there's books about how the internet is shaping our mentality and so on. So I guess my question is about how to deal inside the force or the policing services with the mentality of, okay, should I trust as a police officer, should I trust most on tech rather than in my human skills, especially when facing or dealing with a dangerous situation?
Yeah, no, that's great. Great question. I'll kick off if you don't mind. There's two things every cop hates: the way things are and change.
Absolutely true.
And probably that's the case in every one of your organizations as well, by the way. So, God forbid, I remember as a brand new sergeant in 51 Division down in Regent Park, where Regent Park was then known as Fort Apache, the Bronx. This is the mid-1990s. And Craig Bermel was actually a constable on D Platoon. I remember walking onto the parade, and I was part of the sergeants who were handing out brand new, ruggedized laptops that officers would be able to take into the car so they could do the reports inside the house, not inside the car, and extend a community policing element. Well, every cop hated the manual typewriters that they had to bang away on with the block of paper that, with the inserts to get all the way through. So, we thought they'd welcome the application of technology in these laptops. They hated it. They hated the Olivetti typewriters and they hated the laptops. So they took them out to the cars, and within a minute, someone poured a Tim Hortons double-double right into the keyboard to fry the very first laptop that went into a car. Now, if we said to a police officer in Toronto or Peel, we're going to take that issued phone away from you, that smart device, out of my cold, dead hands, will you take that issued piece of technology? What a long way we've come, but not far enough. I'll go back to my last statement and turn it over to the panel to answer your excellent question, sir. But if any one of those new generation cops or the 30-year-old veteran who's got their phone and still hasn't quite figured out how to use WhatsApp yet, if at any point they lose their heart and their humanity, they are more dangerous than they ever were before and more useless to Canada than they ever will be in the future. So I think you asked a question knowing the answer. The answer is it's both. A professional individual who cares about public service and providing that within the communities where they work, using the best technology that their organization can give them, while keeping the best of their humanity at every stage of their young career to the very last day of their career. I invite others.
Yeah, I think I can address that very well. And I've been in policing for 30 years. So I've seen multiple generations of police officers, and I've seen every archetype that you talked about. And I think we have to recognize that the pendulum has shifted. So when I first started in IT, there was a lot of, I don't want to use this, coffee, and then the laptops, absolutely all of that. Now the pendulum switched completely the other way. Officers starting to like, where's my iPhone? I need to do this, I need a tablet. Where do I get the Wi-Fi? They're actually pushing us to be better, to give them more tools so they can be more effective. And I liken it back to probably the days from when police services switched from horses to cars. So, you know, at some point, once officers get there and they're like, they wouldn't say, where's my horse? They're like, where's my car? So that pendulum is shifting. The demographics are shifting. Generational demands and expectations are shifting. We're clearly there. People are demanding more technology from us other than less. There's better, not only adoption, but again, there's solid demand. We have an infinite pipeline of great ideas and great things that we can do from our police membership that we just can't get to because there's so many great ideas. So I think we're there. We're at that inflection point where technology before was a bolt-on, but I mean, if you were born after 1993, you don't remember a world before the internet, right? You don't know what a phone book is. And you know, I used to make the joke of the people who couldn't get technology, that their VCR is still flashing 12 o'clock. And people say to me, what's a VCR? So we're there.
Full confession, my VCR is still flashing 00.
So the other big component of that is, I remember when I first started, the policing tech was kind of like really bulky and kind of horrendous, right? You're like, oh, what do I do next? Well, now we all have iPhones or smartphones, and I always ask people, when you got your smartphone, did you go through the how-to guide to set it up? And everyone's like, no. Well, the reason for that, it doesn't come with a how-to guide. It's just a device. There's no need for it anymore. When you download an app, do you go through any sort of manual? No, it's supposed to be intuitive, and that's how the tech is being built, and we're starting to see that in policing as well. And I know we're wrapping up, but to me the bigger issue is, what does the next generation of policing looks like? What are going to be the futuristic crimes that AI is going to create, and how are police services going to address that? I'll just share one quick example, and I'll quote the criminal code. I think it's 162.1 sub 1 of the criminal code. Talks about intimate images. So if you send your partner an intimate image, and that individual then shares it, that's a criminal offense, right? What happens when that image is AI generated? It actually, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't actually fall within the definition because it wasn't an actual image of the individual. And we're seeing this increase in what we call Unify apps. Now, if you look at the latest smart devices, they have new technology called spatial technology, where you can take a picture, you can take a video, and you can essentially relive it. It feels like you're back in that video. Now, if you take that and put AI and let's just take Peter, for example. If I was to, he's given multiple public interviews and speeches. I could take every speech he's ever given. I can plug that into some sort of bot and recreate Peter, essentially a deep fake of Peter. Now, imagine me being able to go into VR or AR or whatever, because I could literally wear a headset, and now the technology exists, and Peter shows up, right? What if it's your ex-partner or your ex-spouse? We've seen some horrific examples of this as well. My point is that the technology in policing is changing. It's becoming more intuitive from a productivity level. But crime, when we think about fraud and victimization, is changing at an exponential rate. And the way the crime is changing and the technology and the resources that police services are being given is disproportionate. And I think that's just going to further widen the gap and create further victimization.
Please don't
And
use Peter to create anything, by the way.
And I just want to agree with everything that's been said here, that the reliance on technology is essential for the police force, and it needs to grow. The existing level of it will continue to increase, and the reliance on increasing products and services will have to match that in order to continue.
So folks, unfortunately, I'm not going to, we're literally with a minute to go, but I will come over after, and maybe we can get an answer to your question. Or if there's a question that you couldn't ask now, but you could ask Michael Bryant, who's our keynote speaker after or later, then we'll do it there. First, let me just, again, thank Tom Axworthy for giving us this opportunity to be here today, Massey College for hosting us. I did my best. I said, Tom, look, I'm going to try to get some of the best experts to come in and be available. We marketed this, and we've actually got some of the best experts in this room, incredibly here. I have to tell you, I am learning a lot and enjoying this a lot, and I hope you are pleased. We're going to take a little break here, coffee and carbs, washroom, networking. Please come back in 15 minutes. Michael Bryant is going to be here to deliver an incredible keynote. I want to thank my panelists up here today. I know each of them, Tony's probably the one I know least, but we probably know each other for the longest, ironically. Just an incredibly passionate, knowledgeable, and approachable group of people, and I just feel really honored to have shared the stage with you here today. So thanks very much. We'll see you in a few minutes.